So if I put some values in here, there's our steady state level of capital and output. And if A goes from 1 to 2, turns out our output capital line is going to shift up. It'll double. So for every value of K, output will be higher. And simultaneously, even though our investment rate has stayed the same, because investment is a function of output rather than capital, when output goes up, investment will go up, even though our investment rate will not. And so our green line will shift up, as well as our y equals a k to the alpha line will also shift up. So the book has this here. This here would be our, right? As our technology level increases, going from 1 to 2, our line moves up because output is double for every unit of capital. What does this mean in the bigger picture? Again, this would be a case where we have our output. Now in this picture, we're only going from an A of 1 to an A of 1.5. But in effect, our investment line will also shift up because 30% of a larger value is a larger value. Now this picture is a little hard to navigate, but if we think about what will happen is, if we started at 225, let's assume that we started at the old steady state, which means we would be at A prime up there. Our steady state level of output would be 15. And our steady state level of investment and depreciation would be at point A down below. Now, as soon as our technology goes from 1 to 1.5, our output line goes from the blue output line to the red output line, and we go from A prime to B prime. That would happen immediately. And then what happens is we are at point B on our investment line, and we are still at A on our depreciation line, which means now our investment is greater than our depreciation. So next year, we're going to have a greater level of capital because we are going to be adding more machines than break down, which means now we are going to move gradually. We're going to jump straight from A prime to B prime, which is, again, in the real world, probably not entirely plausible. And then gradually we will move from 225 towards 506. But it turns out I never actually answered the question of how long it would take us to get there. So how long would it take us with a higher level of technology to get from B prime to C prime? Well, the answer is forever. We will never get there. Why? Well, this is the equivalent of us figuring out where you are located right now and where I'm located. And tomorrow, you travel half the distance to me. And the day after that, you travel half the distance remaining to me. And the day after that, you travel half the distance remaining. As you can probably imagine, eventually we would be millimeters apart, but if we could precisely move, we would actually never touch. We would move closer in smaller and smaller increments. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because again, remember, the more capital that we add, holding everything else constant, the less impact each additional unit of capital has. And simultaneously, the further out we get here, the closer we will get to the steady state level of capital and output, which means the closer our depreciation and investment lines get, which means that we are adding ever decreasing amounts of additional capital. And simultaneously, that capital that we are adding generates a smaller positive impact on output. So hopefully you can understand how these lines are moving around. Again, I cannot encourage you enough to go set this up in Excel. Then you can play with any of the parameters and you can see if your intuition about what's happening is correct here. Part of what's difficult here, one of the common mistakes people make, is that in this graph, there is no explicit time. Turns out that we can figure out growth across time from this model and then graph it like I've done. But there is actually no time in this model. So With compounding rates of growth and output, we can get this here. And what does this look like? This looks like the historical thing that we saw, right? That sudden takeoff, that shoot from a very small, low level to a dramatic improvement. And most of that has happened in the last 50 years around the world. So how did we get these numbers? So first of all, I'll put this in growth terms. And I was able to get us to stabilize here right around 2.3% growth. But it turns out the way I did that was by building into the model 1.1% growth in technology or technical knowledge. So this, of course, raises the question, if we now know in our model what would cause, in our functional form here, what would cause sustained rates of growth, what would cause cutting edge growth, it requires a continued expansion in technical knowledge, in scientific ideas, in new ways of doing things. And again, we can dump in organizational structures in here. Of course, this raises the question of what causes compounding rates of growth in technology. And it turns out, again, we already know the answer. Because just like investing in other factors of production, the decision as to whether to invest in technology or not is, of course, driven by the incentives, and the incentives themselves are determined by the institutions. So yet again, we understand and have an answer, even if we don't always have the story to go with that answer. So our task here, if you think about where we set out, our task was to explain compounding rates of growth in output. And we went through and we ruled out a bunch of stuff. We ruled out, right? We ruled out physical capital. We ruled out human capital. We ruled out labor. Our answer ends up being compounding rates of growth in Y, or compounding rates of growth in technology. But as I mentioned, we've ruled out changes in capital. They on their own can't get us there. We've also ruled out changes in labor because that, while it can increase GDP, cannot on its own increase GDP per capita, which if you think back is what I showed you when I showed you that amazing hockey stick across time. We've also ruled out changes in human capital because they on their own also can't get us there because there are diminishing marginal returns to human capital and there's a high depreciation rate, the exact same thing that is causing our physical capital to be unable to explain the historical record. We've also ruled out changes in the savings rate, partially because they are pretty stable across time, and also partially because there's an upper bound limit. So do you find this satisfying? Now, personally, I don't find this completely satisfying. Our task was to explain compounding rates of growth and output, and our answer is, well, if you have compounding rates of growth in ideas, then you're going to have compounding rates of growth in output. But in some ways, we've at least ruled out some stuff. We've zoomed in, we've narrowed it down, and while this seems fairly simplistic, it's actually revolutionary. So if you think about most development assistance, foreign aid over the last 50 to 80 years, foreign aid really started largely after World War II and decolonization and some of the Cold War striving for vassal states. But most of that, even today, is predicated on the idea that all we have to do is increase the physical capital or the machines in poor countries and they're going to grow. Or alternatively, if we just increase the education of kids, we just increase their human capital, we're going to have long-term growth. Now, this isn't to say that increasing human capital and opportunities for people who are otherwise not plugged into the system, that's a bad thing. That's not what we're saying at all. It's also not saying that changing the amount of physical capital is a bad thing. There are many reasons to do those things. There are many reasons to increase human capital. There may be many reasons to increase access to the physical capital and human capital contained in the medical system. But it turns out none of those things are going to cause long-term growth. Now that, of course, the only thing we care about isn't long-term growth, but it's part of what we care about. And we've at least ruled out that those things are the cause. Now we also know that the fundamental cause in the big picture of long-run growth is institutions. We also now can say that the institutions that matter are going to be the ones that encourage people to invest in and use ideas. Now, if we think about ideas, it turns out that there are many reasons to think that ideas have spillovers, positive spillovers. In other words, if you generate an idea, it has an impact on me, a positive one. And it also turns out that ideas are non-rivalrous in consumption. In other words, if I use the idea of fire, that does not mean that there is less of that idea for you to consume. So when we have things that have positive spillovers, in other words, you get some benefit out of my actions that I don't take into account, I bear all the cost of investing in an idea and you get some of the benefit, we would expect an underprovision. So that is exactly what we expect. It also turns out that the compounding growth almost certainly means that we have to be able to build on previous ideas. If you invest in ideas but you keep your ideas secret, it's going to be harder and harder to have compounding rates of growth in ideas. And so we want both the production of these ideas and the publication of these ideas. And what this means, since ideas are central to growth, and this includes ideas about rules and institutions and organizations. So you see what I did there? I basically backdoor dropped in institutions and organization through A. That's what pretty much all of the models do. I don't really like doing it that way because it actually violates the underlying assumptions of the models, but hey, it gets us some insight even if it violates the assumptions. So we know that ideas are central to growth and that they're likely to be underprovided, and that if they are provided, they're likely to be kept private. And so this is actually the argument for intellectual property and government intervention. So if we could use government to find ways to increase useful idea production, not just idea production, but useful idea production. If we could use government to do that, then we could have more ideas and more growth. This, as I mentioned, is really what we have done with intellectual property law. With a patent, if you think about patents, what you have to do to file, or historically what you had to do to file a patent. Well, first of all, a patent created a property right. It meant that you had a monopoly on an idea for a certain period of time. And any of you who've taken micro can hopefully draw up what would happen with a monopoly. It will allow you to engage in monopoly pricing, thus increasing your price above marginal cost, thus causing you to make positive economic profit. Cool. Of course, that positive economic profit is a signal for other people to come in and imitate you. And so what we can do if we give you a monopoly is you now can increase price above marginal cost, making positive economic profit. So we've found a way to increase the incentive for people to generate ideas. And that's how patents work. That's the argument behind patents. In other words, we understand that we're going to have some anti-competitive behavior because of the patent, but then we are at least going to have the ideas. Now, it turns out historically, in order to be granted a patent, you also had to file a working prototype of your invention with the patent office. And that invention was itself made public. And so this is the argument behind the patent system. And it's also the argument behind the copyright system. Looking at it this way, by the way, has caused me to stop pirating videos, to pay for the things that I use, to at least pay for a streaming service. Now, part of that has come because my integrity and ethics, I would argue, are a normal good. Compared to graduate school, I have a much higher income, and so I can afford to have principles. But I also think we should at least understand that if we don't pay for the things that we value, we're going to have fewer of them. But I also understand that from a private individual point of view, my paying does not actually, right? This is a standard collective action problem. If I pay and nobody else does, we're still not going to have ideas or good movies or good books. And if everybody else pays and I don't, we are still going to have them. So this is a standard case of a collective action problem. And that's the argument for government intervention, is that we would use government or collective action to overcome issues where private incentives are not going to work effectively. So that's the rosy case for using government. There may be a caveat here. There's a but. So here's the unfortunately. Turns out that governments often decrease incentives to produce ideas. How do they do that? Stop for a moment and think. Maybe pause the video. Try and figure out how or why am I making the claim that governments often decrease the incentives to produce ideas? They also oftentimes do things to decrease the population. Now, why would decreasing the population matter? Well, think about now this is a gross simplification, but either you could think about this as all of us have one good idea in our lifetime and having fewer people around means fewer good ideas. Or alternately, that there are certain members of the population, just a certain percentage of the population is going to be a genius. And what that would mean is if we have a smaller population, we will by definition have fewer geniuses. Now, let's go back to how do governments decrease the incentives to produce ideas. So this here is the population piece. So how do governments decrease the incentives to produce ideas? Well, one way is through high tax rates. One way is also through licensing restrictions. So you could come up with a great idea, but if you can't get government approval for it, then you're probably not going to bother putting that idea into place. So taxes, regulations, variety of things. Wait, have we heard anything about those things? That sounds an awful lot like some of the pieces that fall under institutions, the EFW or our broader category of institutions. If you go look at a lot of the pieces in the EFW, certainly the regulation of credit, labor, and business, you're going to see a lot of things that would impinge on or diminish people's incentive to invest in ideas. So I want to close here. I have a picture here. This is not a perfect picture. This is a picture of publications, academic publications. Now, I do not believe that all meaningful ideas come from academic publications. that is patently not true. But it's a proxy perhaps, or at least it's a proxy for something. So if you look here, part of what I've been a little troubled by is that you start in 2009, you see a drop-off, a pretty significant decline. And now I haven't updated this. I need to look at this and see what has happened in the subsequent 10 years. But one of the questions that would be relevant for you all thinking about the future of growth. Yes, we have a short-term recession on the horizon probably. I suspect this is going to be at least 3 months, 12 weeks of severe economic downturn as many of us engage in social distancing, and some people, a fair number of people, their whole industry shuts down. The question, of course, is what's the big picture? A 3-month downturn that is followed by a dramatic uptick and a long-term growth isn't going to be a problem. It'll actually be a boon. Not the downturn, but it will be a blip on the horizon. The question is what the long-term trend looks like. And this is one of the frustrations I have in teaching this stuff, is that what the news focuses on and what most of us are prone to focus on is the short-term horizon. In other words, the cycle. There's oftentimes a business cycle or an economic cycle. It's boom and bust. It goes up and down. But the question is, what's the trend? What's the long-term trend? And I would much rather have a high volatile economic or short-term cycle with a much higher trend. Because in the long run, in the medium to the long term, we're going to have much higher standards of living. And so the question is, what is happening to science? Was this downturn blip that you see towards the end of this, was that just an odd little outlier? Or is that what's happening in science? And again, there's the other question of what is the connection between scientific publications and meaningful, productive ideas that are implemented in the economy? Of course, all of this is certainly tied to what are the incentives for people to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. So hopefully that gives you some perspective in some sense. I don't have an answer necessarily as to what the future of growth is going to be. That's really something that you, at least, what I'm trying to give you is a set of tools to talk about that. I'm less concerned about answers than you having a set of analytic tools to come up with your own answers and to lay out a cogent line of thinking. And much of it will be, it depends. I was asked last week whether I would go on television, local television, and talk about what will happen to the economy as a result of COVID. At the time, I was in the midst of trying to figure out how I was going to at least pretend to give you all value in my classes. And so I said, I should probably get my classes in line before I start I should probably find a way to effectively communicate with my students before I spend my time trying to effectively communicate with the general public. But I did jot down some notes, and at least part of my notes really were going to be something that news anchors almost certainly would detest, and that was going to be, it depends. It depends. It depends on a number of things. It depends on whether people stay home, how effectively they stay home. It depends on how quickly this ends. It depends on what the government response is, but whether good or bad. Now, of course, these are all responses to the short-term question. Had they asked, what do you think growth is going... Now, they didn't ask me anything because I wasn't on any news program, but had they said, not, what do you think the impact on the Montanan economy will be over the next year? But if they had said, what do you think the impact on the Montanan economy will be 10 years from now, I'd have actually a much better answer for the impact on the economy in the next 10 years. The answer would be, this pandemic is going to have almost no impact over the next 10 years. However, the response to the pandemic and what it means for economic freedom and what it means for the incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production, particularly ideas, but also organizational structure and the other factors of production, that is going to depend a lot on what our response is. And depending on our response, we could have great economic growth in the next 10 years, or we may have absolute crap economic growth in the next 10 years. What happens in the next 10 years is going to make a much larger impact on well-being than what happens in the next 3 months. And hopefully now you have some big picture tools. Now, these are not great short picture tools, short-term tools. These are the big picture ones. If we have time this semester, we're going to get to models of short-term economic growth. I'm not making guarantees that we're going to get there, but we may. But you at least have some tools and a framework to ask and hopefully start answering some questions based on certain parameters, and be able to chart out a few different paths that you think are likely.